Well, you're welcome to stay on, and we can still get the benefit of your wisdom, even
All
if we
right, I'm
can't
happy to
see
stay on,
you.
and I'll just keep working on in the background.
Okay, all good. Hi everyone, and apologies for the technical issues. But we're very glad that you are joining us today for the fifth episode of ECO's Ignite series, which is a series of webinars and learning sessions that are made available to all ECO members. So this is being recorded. It's also being streamed on YouTube, and we share it with all of ECO's member organizations um, across more than 40 countries. So welcome. And of course, we are going to be talking today about, I think, probably what is one of the most important communications priorities over the last couple of years. The title of the session today is Rerouting Geopolitics, Narratives and the Power of Communications. I think anyone that has been paying attention to the communications world will be aware that geopolitics has inexorably moved up the agenda in recent years. I can remember a time when communications leaders and agencies rarely spoke of geopolitics. But in the last 2 to 3 years, I have noticed, particularly in specific research studies, that geopolitics is often ranked as the top priority for communications leaders. So it has been a huge shift. We will talk about why, and we will talk about how that affects communications leaders, agency PR professionals um, on today's webinar. And of course, we will also try and make time for any questions that we get from the floor. But before all that, let me first introduce our amazing panel today, all female, which is fantastic to see. From Australia, although not via video, but we will be able to hear her views. We have Angela Scafidi, who's the founding partner and chair of Senate SHJ. From the UAE, we have Iman Issa, who's the co-founder and managing partner of North 75. From Nairobi, Kenya, we have the founder and CEO of Glasshouse PR, Mary Njoki. And from India, Soumya Prabhakar, Chief Operating Officer of the Takshashila Institution. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Arun.
Thank
you.
Thank
All
you for
right,
having us.
so it's a pleasure. It's our pleasure. So let's get this underway. I'm going to ask, I'll probably ask a few questions for around 30 minutes or so, and then we'll see if we have any questions. But I think the biggest change we've seen geopolitically is this shift from what you might describe as a unipolar world to a much more multipolar environment, or at least one with competing centers of power. And that's also, I think, to a certain extent, been mirrored in the shift from an economic environment, particularly in the comms world, that was dominated by Western-based multinationals, to quite a different landscape. We're seeing companies now emerging from so many different countries, and with different communications priorities, different narrative nuance. And I think ultimately this idea that this kind of one size fits all communications approach is perhaps no longer fit for purpose. But let me start off by asking our panelists how these shifting global power centers, before we talk about corporates themselves, how shifting global power centers are changing the way that geopolitical narratives are created and contested and believed. Because that seems to be undergoing quite significant disruption. And Soumya, if you don't mind, if I could start with you, given that you have quite a strong policy background, and I feel like you could give us some quite valuable context for this question.
Sure, Arun, thanks for that. So for us, I think being in a complex adaptive systems, right, currently, no one actually controls these narratives. I feel everybody is out there to contest it, right? And that comes from a place of, okay, there's lack of information and ambiguity in the geopolitics environment that we live in. But I've increasingly seen that today, hope should not just be a feeling of sorts, but I feel it's a strategy in itself. So I feel narratives need to shift globally in this context of hope, because a lot of times I feel that people are in this negative mode, right? In the geopolitics environment, you see a lot of despondence in some sense. And in my head, in Sanskrit, we call it karmane vadika raste, which means that you focus on your action and the outcome will follow. So for me, today, communicators should actually talk to stakeholders about these narratives and make sure they give them a horizon to move forward. Because in most of my conversations, when we talk to people in the PR world or in general about geopolitics, there's this angst. And I know it is meant to be there for a reason, that a lot of things are surprise elements that's coming our way. But I think the most powerful way to act on it is to walk through this in the context of hope. And in India, especially, I believe that we all have thrived with a better tomorrow kind of a context. So I feel that narrative holds true even today. And most people in this country would believe that we have a better future, and that's how we thrive on these narratives. So I feel the geopolitics environment truly needs these narratives to take us forward.
Well, I think that's a great note on which to start. Iman, if maybe we could come to you next. And I'm curious to hear your views on this question, particularly in light of Soumya's comments that perhaps we need to move from angst towards hope in terms of how we're talking about some of these geopolitical narratives.
I actually really like the concept of hope. And I think here in the Middle East and the UAE, what we've seen over the last period of time is that even though there's been a lot of turbulence and difficulty, we've actually seen our governments really lean into and double down on how they talk to the community and the residents. And a lot of the messaging that we have seen has been around tolerance, coexistence. It's been around safety and stability. So whilst we're in an unstable world, we are seeing that the kind of communication that is coming out from trusted institutions and source of authority is really to make sure that those values that connect societies and build trust really are what carrying everyone through these types of moments.
So another vote for hope. I don't suppose anyone will vote against hope. But Mary, is it always that simple in terms of changing the way geopolitical narratives are believed? Is it as simple as making them more hopeful, or should we be just as cognizant perhaps of some of the challenges?
I think for me, I'd look at the opportunities and the challenges that have been presented, and I'd like to take us on a journey. So we've come to a place where we are seeing the shift from unipolar to multipolar, and for a long time, the narrative, for example, for Africa was shaped by the superpowers, the governments, the media, the institutions, and they determined the perspective or the way people looked at Africa. But then now there's a shift and there are more players that are coming up, whether it's China, India, the Gulf countries. And for us, and I'm speaking from an African perspective, one is to see there's alternative partnerships that can come about in terms of, projects, etc. But then just as my colleague spoke earlier, for Africa policymakers, and I think communication experts are part of it, to make sure that whatever project is coming into a country is not based on an external narrative. It's based on the local priorities that are there, but also to see from the other angle, how can we shift from being just the consumers, but producers of content. So for me, it's more of an opportunity that is being presented, especially for Africa, because the misrepresentation, the narratives that have always been out there was shaped by someone else, and they had an agenda. But then how do we now, seeing that we've come to a place of multipolar world, make sure we also come as equal players on the table, but then, from a communication perspective, make sure we bring our narrative. We come and say, actually, Africa is not one country. There are 54 countries. There's diversity. There's, minerals. There's all these amazing things that are happening. So for me, I see it as an opportunity that we can also, especially and I'll speak from, Global South Africa, that there's so much more that now we can bring on the table based on the communication opportunity being presented. Yeah.
If I could just build on what Mary was saying, I think obviously in today's world, everything depends on the audience that we're looking at and the type of conversation that we're having at any given moment in time. So during moments of instability, a government or an institution or a corporation might focus on its local community. But when you start to look outwards towards different types of markets, you'll have a different approach. And so in that case, you might have much more boldness in how you communicate, much more direct messaging, and you might be more willing to address misinformation, misperceptions. And we're already seeing governments do that, particularly from our part of the world, where they're correcting information that's been placed in the kind of public realm that might be incorrect.
Yeah, I think there's a much bigger opportunity in terms of empowering local communicators that is emerging from this, I guess, more multipolar, maybe more fragmented global communications landscape. Angela, how do you see it from Australia? And how are you seeing the geopolitical discourse changing from your part of the world?
Yes, and apologies that you can't see me, but at 9:50 p.m. on a Wednesday night, unfortunately, there's no one in IT support in my office. You'll be surprised. So yes. I mean, I guess one of the things, so from an Australian point of view, we are trying to build a narrative about our role at a regional level. So, going, sort of transforming more from this kind of Australia, this very far away country that kind of people, think of kangaroos and, somewhere far off in the distance, but us wanting to play much more of a role as a sort of regional middle power. And I think the challenge in Australia is trying to balance our relationship and our relationship with China with our relationship with the US. And it's tricky because we need both of those relationships, particularly if we want to play more of a role at a regional level. And I guess the challenge we face as communicators is that narratives, as we know, are really contested from the very beginning. So if you think about Ukraine or tensions in the South China Sea, it really does, to your point, depend on the audience and how it's framed at a local level. So we're in Australia, where on one hand we might say, well, we need to have a relationship with the US from a security perspective. They're a kind of protector and security partner. Others might say, well, why do we need to be associated with such a sort of aggressive superpower? And would they really protect us? If push came to shove, would they really protect us? So I guess it's kind of perspective matters, but I think this idea that we have to grapple with as communicators is how do we, as narratives are contested, what's the role we might play to kind of help cut through, for example.
Yeah, I guess particularly when you may have clients or indeed you work for companies that are it's disproportionately influenced by some of the ways that these geopolitical narratives play out, right? So, for example, in Australia, perhaps energy companies and others. The other thing, of course, that we're seeing these days that I think we can't avoid is the proliferation of AI generated content. We're seeing that having I think it might be too early to say what impact it's having on perceptions, but we're definitely seeing a lot of it being deployed. I mean, certainly in the Gulf, for example, we've seen all the Lego stuff, for example. We see the world's most powerful leader using AI videos all the time. It's quite disconcerting in many ways. From your perspective as a communicator, how are you able to distinguish influence from manipulation in global discourse? And what's your advice for people who maybe are not professional communicators? So maybe if I could start with you, Iman, on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the concept of AI generated videos from global leaders is new to all of us and probably won't go away anytime soon. And whilst it's slightly terrifying, I think there's a lot to be said for how it is being used right now, and it's not going to stop, right? That's the reality. We live in a world where content can be generated at speed. And I think the opposite side of this is then how do you use it in a positive way? So if we need to rapidly deploy information that can protect society or can enhance work that has been done, that's where it becomes a really useful tool. And I think you will start to see governments lean into the rapid deployment of content using tools, but being really transparent in how it was created. And I think that's the difference between when you're trying to manipulate society versus influence society. A lot of it is around the source, the authenticity of it, the accuracy of the information that's included in it, and obviously how you created it in the first place. It's not wrong to say we're using AI. It's about saying we've used it. This is the way in which you've used it. This is the way in which it's being deployed. And I think the speed of which you can use that information then becomes the tool, and it becomes less around the conversation of actually using the tool in the first place, if that makes sense.
Yes, indeed. It's a really good point, actually, on distinguishing perhaps the tool from the conversation. Angela, over to you next, if you don't mind.
Yes, I mean, I guess one of the things to think about is the purpose of the content. Like, are we helping someone to make a choice, or are we forcing them into a choice with the content? And I think that helps sometimes for you to kind of step back and say, is it about encouraging, helping people, giving them choice, helping them to, use their critical thinking, or are we emotionally or otherwise kind of forcing them into a choice? And I guess that then helps us. Are we influencing or are we manipulating? It kind of gives you a bit of a lens through which to look at that question.
Good advice. Good test for everyone to bear in mind, I think. Mary?
I mean, for me, what comes to mind is on the AI governance, and to think through how can we, govern. And I know it changes every day. I'm sure there's something else that has come up today on AI. So how do we have frameworks that can be able to help us governance across? And also from a communication perspective, can we be able to judge what we see, what was the intention of the communication, and also focus more on fact checking, which is quite critical this day and age, and especially with elections across the globe. When we have election years, we'll always see interesting content going out, especially if it's for the opponent, and all this communication is going out there. So I would focus on the governance and the policy frameworks around AI, but also now from communication perspective, can we think through fact checking? What are the intention of the communication? The transparency around it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think very important observations. Although I do wonder if the governance will ever catch up with usage at this point. I hope so. Soumya, over to you.
Yeah, an extension to what Mary just said. For me, I think the most tricky part has been the AI bias. And I don't think it's just about the algorithms, right? I think one worldview fits all by default is something that I kind of am bothered with. So one worldview rather than algorithms is a concern that I kind of constantly think about, and I don't have a good answer yet. But I feel the AI dominant tools have no context of our realities. Like I feel there's a huge gap there. There is underrepresented inputs, and I feel we need to think about the cognitive autonomy before we trust what data we are kind of using. And I feel we don't yet have a dominant AI. And this gap, I think, is both an opportunity and a risk for us. So I believe we need to work towards de-risking this.
Sorry, when you say cognitive autonomy, what do you mean exactly?
So what happens is at this point, whatever data is out there, what has been generously put into the system is what it's processing. But if people are going to make assumptions, make decisions based on that, then we're going to get onto the wrong side, because the context for what happens in the Western part of the world is so different from an Indian context. So as much as we would like to be in this game, and I think what we can't ignore, we definitely need to embrace and move on. But unless we have a dominant AI system from India, I think we will grapple with this problem.
Yeah, indeed, from any country. I think AI itself is susceptible
Yeah.
to geopolitics in this fashion.
Yeah.
So very good point. Does anyone else want to make any more comments on AI? Otherwise, I would like to ask you all about global institutions. Okay, so I think one thing that we are also seeing in tandem with increasing geopolitical complexity, and maybe this is indeed a factor in this increasing complexity, is declining trust in governments, in media, and in multilateral institutions. And of course, much of it is, maybe is a result of manipulation and malign forces to some extent. But whatever the reasons, I think there is enough research out there on that decline in trust. And I'm curious to know whether our panelists feel that communicators can realistically play any kind of a role in rebuilding credibility. Is that something that's desirable? Is it something that perhaps communicators should be focused on doing? So Mary, if I could start with you.
Thank you. I think for us in Africa, we don't trust, and I think it's everywhere, but we don't trust our governments, we don't trust international organization, any partners, we are always suspecting everyone. So I think how strategic communication experts can play a role is number one, helping governments or these organizations, not just to put out messages out there, but also to make sure that whatever message or whatever promise a government makes, it's actually lived out. So we move from just putting out messages, but to make sure that the most effective communication is rooted in action. And because the reason people don't trust, it's because, we don't have results. Everyone is just saying whatever they can say out there, but they're not results. So I would insist on us helping them to create not just strategies, but also come into a place where there's citizen engagement, transparency, action, and actually keeping them accountable in these matters. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Soumya?
Yeah. So I think everybody is renegotiating in this geopolitics world today, right? Everybody is trading off a lot of things. So for me, again, I think a plurilateral system, like a specific issue-based group, like a Quad thing, will kind of fill these gaps of trust, because I think there's good, at least for India, I think a strategic autonomy will offer, or rather will allow us to be flexible, will allow us to have better bargaining power and economic bandwidth as well. So I feel trust is the core to what I initially said as well, the hope that things will shape up to be better. And I think this whole trust network is something that needs to stay consistent. And I think only when there is an honest narrative being floated and the ability to say, okay, we don't have good answers for something, is the way forward. So at least in my head, the trust network is going to get renegotiated in a lot of instances, given the geopolitics flux today.
Mm. Yeah, I think both of you, I mean, the importance of accountability and indeed autonomy, I think is emerging from both your answers. Angela, how do you see the role of communicators in terms of rebuilding credibility, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's only so much communications can do, and so we need to be realistic about that. I do think sometimes that we often think about the narrative that people experience. So a multinational has a narrative. That narrative might be experienced at a very local level. And I guess sometimes the question we try and think about is, what's the role of employees in helping to frame that narrative at a local level, to share that, to sort of be ambassadors for that narrative, so that they're kind of talking to their local communities about whatever those issues on that narrative is, and helping to kind of sort of embed it and translate it at a local level. So sometimes it's because I think sometimes organisations are these sort of large machines that are so kind of disconnected from people's kind of experience of every day. So sometimes, how do we help people experience those organisations at a very local level through their employees is kind of one thing we often think about. And I remember many years ago, I worked on I mean, I might have been in the 90s, that's aging me, but you can't see me, so you don't know how old I am. But I worked at McKinsey's, and we were working on a cultural change program, which was about working with a bank and giving a human face to that bank, because people didn't trust the bank, but it was this idea about how do we kind of bring the human face and humans to the fore and help people have a connection with other humans rather than the bank as an entity. And I just think it's a kind of interesting thing for us to think about, particularly if we're thinking about communication, both externally but also internally.
I mean, I suspect that's one of the reasons for this trust deficit, is that gap at a local level, particularly when you look at some of the big political events of recent times. I think Brexit is a good example of that. This whole idea that people don't trust experts or people in positions of authority anymore. Iman, you're in a region where there is relatively high trust, though, in governments and in institutions. Any lessons from your perspective?
Yeah, I was going to say that I think part of the problem that we have when we look around the world is that there's so many different opinions, so much diversity, that it becomes really hard to unify a community around common values, common themes. And I think what we see in this region is a real doubling down on values-based communications. So they've spent a lot of time thinking about the society and the community that they're creating here, and going, well, what will unite people from many different places with many different backgrounds? And how do we start to create those red threads that, whether you're from, the UK or the Western region, or from Africa or from different parts of the world, that you are able to buy into those values and you can adopt them and you can live by them. And so what you see in our part of the world is there's a huge amount of communication around quality of life, safety and stability, tolerance and coexistence. And if you contrast around the world, you don't see enough positive momentum around what is being done to create harmony in society, to provide better access to healthcare, to provide better quality of life. You see often there's more complaints around those areas and less focus on solutions. And I think what we can learn from our region is how can you help society start to talk positively about the change that's happening, or to be part of the solution for some of those areas that impact them on a day-to-day basis. And then that ultimately is what's going to bring society together. Obviously, we live in a region as well that's quite new. It has a lot of different challenges to more mature parts of the world, but there's still a lot to be said for how you bring diverse communities together and really think about the values that connect society, and it's missing in today's world.
Yeah, it sometimes feels like there's more communication that's intended to divide people than unify them these days. Soumya, were you about to say something?
Yeah, and go ahead, Arun, you finish and then I'll.
No, that's my point. You go ahead.
Okay, so my own experience in India of having worked with rural communities, I saw how beautifully this trust network of self-help groups work. I'm not too sure if it's similar in other parts of the world, but in India, the women network, where especially in rural areas, women come together, it's about one, they get credit access, financial credit, which allows them to run small entrepreneurial ventures. And then in the process, this network also pitches in when they have health crisis or they need to make some decisions on education, all of that. So I've seen how beautifully women have been able to the first generation of women getting credit access and financial literacy has grown because a trust network of self-help groups work beautifully in these rural parts of India.
I think there's a lot to be said for community groups at the moment. And I think when you start to think about trust and how trust is brokered or how trust is spread through communities, you are seeing a doubling down on those types of groups and those types of networks, because what we're seeing is as the world's become more insular, more polarized, it becomes even more important that those trusted neighborhood or family members are the people that will become a source of unity for you.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. We are seeing that, and maybe this is one of the I don't know if it's an unintended consequence, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? That people are looking for that community connection, perhaps more than trusting blindly in monolithic institutions. And I can't see you. I mean, even in the research you look at, in terms of a lot of the trust research, what is it they call it? Person like me or someone like me is still highly trusted, often is the most trusted of all. So we have one question from the floor that has come through, and I also want to ask a question. I will just ask this question to close, and then not to close, but before we move to the question from the floor, because it kind of follows on from Iman's point on values-led communication, which I think is quite interesting. Of course, we've seen, if we talk about corporations for a moment, we have seen them blow hot and cold to an extent in terms of values. We've seen a lot of talk of purpose. Then we've seen silence. We've seen virtue signaling. We've seen performative stuff. But I'm curious to ask how the panelists view this if we are talking about perhaps corporations becoming more values-led in their communication. Do you expect them to take positions on global political and social issues, even when that carries geopolitical risk? Mary, maybe I can come to you first.
It's a very interesting question, and I'd speak from what I've seen and the companies that I've interacted with. There are people who just take positions based on, for example, who they support politically, which becomes a geopolitical risk. But at the same time, I've seen companies that have certain values and have certain themes and missions or visions that they live by. So, for example, there's a company I know that believes in youth employment. So when the government is having conversation around youth employment, they are on the table to support that. Our climate resilience, when the government is having conversation around, the climate mitigation solutions, they are there to support that. So how I would advise from a communication perspective, especially the companies that we work with, is to make sure that you're not just coming to support an agenda that may be of risk to your company, but more so let it be real. Let it be that the vision that you have as a company actually supports the agenda or supports the issue that you want to support in the society. So that I believe from a communication perspective that authenticity is very key, transparency, and even as a company is transparent, it's authentic, people tend to believe this company more, and you tend to have more impact in the society, and you're not pretending. So it's both ways. Of course, there are people who will support an agenda because that's what is trending, quote unquote. For example, when we got into the climate change conversations, there are so many companies that are jumping on it, and they have no idea what climate change is. So it's more of insisting on the companies that are jumping on these issues to make sure that this is actually what they believe in, or this is actually what they want to impact on. Yeah.
Iman?
I don't think there's a universal answer to this question, but what I would say is that when you think about moments of peace where the issues that people in a business are worried about, whether that's diversity, equity, inclusion, environment, society, health and well-being, it's easier for a company to have values and a stance in those areas. But when the world shifts into issues that are more polarizing, for example, politics, which are much more divisive, that's when it becomes incredibly hard for a company to have a stance. And I think what I would say here is if an entity is going to take a stance when it's regarding a more political area, then they have to be aware that there will always be people who will agree with that point of view and people who won't agree with that point of view. And you have to be prepared to manage the backlash, if you're going to get one, or the goodwill that could come on it, depending on where people see you sitting favorably. So you have to be really okay with the consequences. But I think the other thing people should be thinking about is more around how do we bring our teams together, right? So when we're talking about any of these issues, it's trying to find those red threads again that can help unify our teams, or provide ways for people to have conversations that allow them to showcase their differences, but in a way that's meaningful and sensitive, so that potentially you can start to bridge different types of understanding. And that actually then has a ripple effect throughout society as well.
Yeah, some very interesting comments so far on first of all on doing your due diligence and indeed being ready for the consequences. Soumya?
Yeah, I think the era of corporations being apolitical is over. We teach public policy to a lot of working professionals, and today I hear that everybody is so curious to understand what the geopolitics environment looks like, because that's how they are kind of imagining how the communication and everything that is decided within the organization is in the direction of understanding how this environment will look like going forward. And I think even governments are now designating tech or even industries as national power. They're using them to kind of have better negotiation. And I feel we all need to think about de-risking the whole stack, right? Look at supply chain, the data, hiring decisions. Today, I think the the whole narratives power is such that today people are very cautious that specific industries, they wouldn't hire people from specific geographies because that's where you see the risk coming. So what Iman was talking about, values-led communications, I think that becomes a crucial part of how we drive things. And we need to accept and expect that this tug of war will exist. There's always this corporation trying to manage between the geopolitics world and the culture and people within the organization. I think it's seeming to be more obvious today, and it's a conversation that every second person has with us.
So the era of companies being apolitical is over.
Yeah.
Angela, do you agree?
It's a good question. I don't think I agree, but I can see that I agree with Iman that it is tough, and I agree that people have got much more of an interest in public policy and want to have more of a say in it, certainly, than I've seen in the past. So I think it is hard. I mean, one of the simple tests you might apply is asking the question, not like, should we say something on an issue, but instead, what have we done that gives us a right to say something? And I think sometimes that's a way of kind of framing it so that it's less about, should we as this kind of very large organization have a say, but actually, are we doing or have we done anything that gives us a right to have a say? And also, are we prepared to be consistent? So because I think that's probably where many of us have seen organisations struggle. Certainly in Australia, organisations that took a very strong stand on marriage equality, but then struggled and maybe also took a very strong stand on the referendum we had around our First Nations people. So people, organisations sponsored, took a big stand, but then when it came to war, around the world, it suddenly organisations were like, well, should we, shouldn't we? What do we say? If we say X, then what does it mean to the rest of our organisation? So it's really interesting to see some of the organisations that are now taking less of a stand, because I think they were a bit burnt by this, coming out very strongly about, say yes to marriage equality and say yes to, increased rights for First Nations people. But then what's our position on some of these other issues? So it's interesting to see organisations kind of grapple.
It's a grapple. It's a tug of war, as I think Soumya said. And it's interesting because you kind of encapsulated both the importance of doing your, of having something to say, which Mary had mentioned, but also of being ready for the consequences, which Iman had raised too. So I think that's between the four of you, that's a really good reckoning in terms of whether companies should speak up or not. There are no simple answers. I think that much is clear from what we've heard today. So we have one question from the floor. We don't have a lot of time left, so I think if we can just perhaps answer this one relatively briefly. In a world marked by geopolitical volatility, what carries greater weight, a compelling narrative or understanding the right moment to deploy it? So how should communicators balance narrative and timing? Or is that perhaps a false dichotomy? Iman, I'll come to you first, if that's okay. I think you're on mute.
Oh, sorry. I don't think you get a choice always on timing. So I think if you're a member of a government, you'll be expected to respond in the moment. If you're a corporation, you potentially have a moment to breathe before you actually respond. For me, I think in this world that we live in right now, it's about radical transparency. If you are going to talk about something, you've got to be really transparent. You've got to own the message. It's not just about going out and saying something and it being pink and fluffy. You have to say it, you have to mean it, you have to back it up. And then you've got to go away and show how you back it up. So people really need that commitment to follow through. And that ultimately will build trust. And I think right now, especially on the global stage, you do see a lot of commentary or a lot of words, but very little action and follow through. And I think that's what's increasing a lot of this distrust that we see in society. So it's much more around the follow through messaging to me.
Okay. Angela?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one of the tests that you might apply is if it's in relation to a particular issue, you know, you're grappling with narrative and timing, you might sometimes propel yourself forward a month or 2 months and say, all right, if I looked back, would we get in more trouble for getting the messaging wrong, or would we get in more trouble for being slow at responding? And I just think it's a potentially, depending on the issue, it's a way of kind of, because I have worked with organisations that have, and hopefully I've tried to advise them, have either got the narrative wrong and or the timing wrong. But yeah, sometimes I think it's certainly when the narrative has not been so definitely a transparency, but also consistent. You know, as an issue emerges, are we being consistent about the things we know, our view, et cetera, So I think that's just one test that we sometimes apply because, you know, you never have the luxury of time. So, you know, yes, we try and strike a balance. Yes, we try and be very open. Yes, we try and have all the answers, but we don't always. So that might be one test you might apply.
Sure. And Mary and Soumya, any thoughts from either of you on this? Mary, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just to add on what my colleagues have said, I'd say understanding the right moment to deploy the message is quite important. And because we can just communicate or respond to an issue and then you end up creating another issue. So for me, right timing is quite important, just to answer the question on the from the panel.
Yeah.
Soumya, you get the final word.
Yeah, I just have 3 things that I probably think are important. One is, especially in a crisis situation, it becomes very reactive in nature because you're emotional. There's a lot of stress to respond to things. I would believe as long as people are grounded to their values, you know, even though it's a crisis situation, you hold the ground and stick to your values. So I feel even though timing might be stiff there, there's merit in sticking to the values. Second, I think more than like fastening the process of saying, oh, a quick response versus having clarity on, okay, did I think through everything, all possibilities, and this is how I process it. Having that window is useful. And third, I would say flag anything that we don't really have answers to. Like for me, a lot of people have asked the social media ban, right? Like I still can't like fix one answer to it. Like as much as I know there's so much that's happening, and Australia, of course, went ahead with the ban, right? I feel there is merit in it, but I also see that a lot of people who engage with it usefully will be denied that access. So I still can't make up my mind on things. So I feel flagging and saying I don't understand it enough, and having that humility also is a good one to have, because a lot of times I feel people feel the need to respond to everything. Not really, right? You can hold the ground and say, maybe I'm not the right person. I don't have the expertise, and that's all right.
Yeah, it's a really good point on which to end. I think we could do a whole other session on the social media ban, especially as it's being discussed and debated and potentially implemented in other countries. And in fact, ECO is, I believe, coming out with a white paper on this soon, and has conducted a survey of its members in terms of how they feel towards these social media bans. So please do look forward to that. I think we'll close the discussion now. I want to thank our panelists so much for their time, and for their candor and for their insight into some quite tricky questions, as the world becomes more complex. But perhaps some of these communications principles are still as simple as they always were. We will have our next ECO Ignite session, I believe, in 1 week. and we have a visual, I think we can show that one on the 17th. So we're talking about deploying AI. So there you go. That's AI for good. Crisis-proof your business. So that should be an interesting one too. So tune in next week for that. And for now, please join me in thanking our panelists, Angela, Iman, Mary, and Soumya. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Arun. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.